Good morning. This sermon, I will present to you a prayer of redemption that you'll never forget. I spent the summer of 1971 in Mankato, Minnesota, selling Bible study materials, door to door. The week before our team was placed in Minnesota, thousands of college students went to Nashville, Tennessee, where we were trained. About 10% of the training had to do with learning our sales talk and sales techniques and filling out reports. But the other 90% prepared us for the most brutal summer any of us had ever faced in our young lives. Long hours, doors slammed in our face, big dogs following us, days and days and days with no sales. Utter discouragement. So why did we do it? For the money? That's the other thing they taught us, at least in the Bible study division. Do it to build character. Do it to become more and more like Jesus. During that week, I was taught a redemption prayer that I prayed something like 500 times during that summer. Here is the prayer of redemption. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. Yeah, you can make some money, but don't do it for that, or you'll give it up. And especially if you don't make much money. My trainers were right on both counts. Door-to-door sales were far more brutal than anything I could imagine, and I didn't make much money. One lady told me that I should go and kill myself, and then she slammed the door in my face. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. Another man asked me, "Who do you work for, kid?" And I told him the truth, the Southwest Company in Nashville, Tennessee. But he refused to believe me, as if there was some kind of conspiracy going on. "Who do you really work for, kid?" I kept telling him the truth. I had nothing to hide. Then he abruptly left the room. I thought to take care of a private matter. Instead, it was to call the police. Next thing you know it, I was in cuffs and thrown into a paddy wagon. Really? No kidding. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to become like Christ. I showed the two young officers my license to sell in Mankato, and they smiled and said, "Don't worry, we'll drop you off a couple blocks away from that nutcase. He's done this before." As for the money, I worked on average 80 hours every week, and I grossed $1 for every hour I worked. And even in 1971, that wasn't going to bankroll my education at Michigan State University. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and be like Christ. Not everyone survived the summer. Every week at our sales meetings, some would be missing, went home, sent home. But those who survived the brutalities of selling door to door did so because our teachers prepared us for the realities of door-to-door sales. They knew what we were in for, and they taught us to redeem door-to-door sufferings by praying a redemptive prayer. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity and grow and become rich. No, become like Christ. To grow comfortable. No, like Christ. To be understood and respected? No, to be like Christ. Now, that summer was hardly the worst thing I ever faced, but it prepared me. And you could even say, in this climate, it vaccinated me from growing weary and losing heart when I did face much bigger things. I didn't make much money, but I learned to consider Jesus instead of considering my door-to-door travails in a much bigger way, much bigger. This is what the New Testament writers do for their readers. See, my trainers prepared me for big, black, barking dogs. The New Testament writers prepared the readers for big, eating lions. But it's the same principle. Redeem everything, even the brutalities and unfairness of persecution. Redeem it into opportunities to become like Christ. Look at how the author of the book of Hebrews does this in our text this morning in Hebrews 12, verse 3. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Hebrews 12:3. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Hebrews 12:1 and 2, where the author exhorts his beloved readers to fix their eyes on Jesus, who is the author and perfecter of their faith. Jesus, the author teaches, is both the living goal to whom we fix our eyes and the means to the living goal that empowers us to reach the goal of becoming like Christ. Now, in verse 3, the author teaches his readers and us to specifically consider the sufferings of Christ. When we get knocked down, what do we tend to consider? What looms large in our mind? What do we meditate on? What grows and grows and grows in our thoughts? Our sufferings, our difficulties. What's happening to me? How can I live with this loss? This is unfair. How could they do that to me? This is unjust. What happens if we consider our sufferings without considering Christ? We will think about our sufferings only from Satan's "what's happening to me now" perspective. What happens if we consider Jesus, who endured such opposition from sinners? We will think about our sufferings from his "what's God up to" eternal perspective. What happens if we consider our sufferings by leaning on our own "all about me" understanding? All about me only looks for here and now reasons. Reason is not the problem. Here and now reasoning is. And what is the main conclusion of considering our sufferings and applying here and now reasoning? What do you think? Such here and now thinking, reasoning, leads inevitably to the conclusion that God doesn't care. And who would go to someone for comfort who doesn't care for us? And a God who doesn't care is such a contradiction that it leads to a God who doesn't even exist. Listen to the stories of those who once considered themselves to be followers of Jesus, but now call themselves atheists or skeptics or agnostics. And you will hear stories of people who could not reconcile suffering with a caring God of love. But what happens when we consider instead the sufferings of Christ? Our here and now reasoning is shredded by Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things. And that's why the author exhorts his persecuted readers to consider him who endured such oppositions from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And even if I cannot figure out God's reason for allowing Elijah, James, Rasmussen, my grandchild, to be born without a heartbeat, I know what the reason isn't. It's not because God doesn't care for me, for my son, for that little child who is in heaven. No one who did what God did by sending Jesus and what Jesus did by going to the cross on our behalf can be accused of not caring. So why would followers of Jesus, like the readers of the book of Hebrews, accuse God of this very thing, not caring? The author reveals the answer in verse 5. You have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. What have they forgotten? And could I forget it? Let's look. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. The Lord disciplines those he loves. Endure hardship as discipline. If you are not disciplined, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. What a cruel thing to say to persecuted under Nero believers. Doesn't the author know that they are victims? How dare he suggest that God is disciplining them? Today, the author would be subject to sensitivity training, blaming the victims. But that's not what's going on. In our culture, we think of discipline as correction, a parent spanking a disobedient child. But in the New Testament culture, discipline referred to a father's training, coaching, if you will, for the perfection of his children. You see, God is the author of our salvation. He is not the author of persecution or cancer or the loss of Elijah, James Rasmussen, or the irate woman who told me to kill myself, or the crank who arrested me, or the brothers who sold Joseph into slavery, or the bullies who abused me when I was 14. But what others intended for evil, God intended for good, the saving of many people. According to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7, hardship is a sign of God's love. The Lord disciplines those he loves. And he tells us to endure hardship as discipline. Now, what our natural self thinks is a sign of no love is actually a sign of infinite love, even if we can't see it. When I was 5, my mother spanked me, and she cried. And my 5-year-old mind wondered, what's going on? My mother, through tears, lamented, "This hurts me more than you." I thought my mother was crazy. I'm the one getting the beating. But now I know. She was crazy about her love for me. She couldn't stand to spank her precious Chucky. God's the same. The author is writing children who think discipline is a sign of no love. And he exhorts them to remember what they have forgotten, that discipline is actually a sign of infinite love. C.S. Lewis, in The Problem of Pain, illustrates this by reminding us of 4 biblical metaphors of God's love. Number 1, the love of an artist for his work. The Bible refers to God's people as clay pots, living stones, God's workmanship or handiwork or even masterpiece. In other words, the process of making us like Christ is metaphorically like the making of a work of art over a sketch made idly to amuse a child, an artist will not take much trouble. But over the masterpiece of his life, he will give endless trouble. Lewis asks us, imagine a living, feeling picture after being rubbed and scraped and redone for the 10th time, wishing that it were only a thumbnail sketch whose making was over in a minute. In the same way, it's natural for us to wish that God had designed us for a less glorious, less arduous destiny. But then, we are wishing not for more love, but for less. Number 2, love of a shepherd for sheep, John 10. The Old Testament teaches that the Lord is our shepherd, and Jesus teaches that he is the good shepherd, thus equating himself with God, which is why his fellow Jews tried to kill him. Since we know more about dogs than sheep, Lewis illustrates with dogs. He says, man interferes with a dog to make it more lovable. In its natural state, it has smells and habits that frustrates man's love. He washes it, house trains it, and teaches it not to steal in order to love his dog completely. Again, he asks us to imagine talking puppies in a theological discussion about the goodness of man. The puppies may conclude, like so many, that they are not loved. But what puppies do not understand is that they are disciplined by man because he loves them. We do not house train a spider or give baths to roaches because we don't love them. We may wish God would leave us alone, but once again, we are asking not for more love, but for less love. Number 3, love of a father for a son. Hebrews 12, 9, and 10, our text today. And Lewis asks, even in our day, what good father would say, I love my son, but I don't care what a scoundrel he becomes, provided he has a good time. So too, with God. God's goal is not a few years of earthly happiness, but becoming like Christ and sharing his happiness for all eternity. We may wish for more earthly happiness and be content with an average amount of eternal holiness, but then we are asking not for more love, but for less. Finally, number 4, right at the top, love of a husband for his wife. Jeremiah 2:2, the book of Hosea, Ephesians 5:25 and following, Revelation 19, all describe God's love in terms of a marriage, as if God was married to his people. Is marital love a mere kindness that tolerates anything as long as our loved one does not suffer? Not at all, says Lewis. When a man falls in love with a woman, does he cease to care whether she is clean or dirty, fair or foul? Do we not rather first begin to care? Does any woman regard it as a sign of love in a man that he neither knows nor cares how she is looking? Love may, indeed, love the beloved when her beauty is lost, but not because it is lost. Love may forgive all weaknesses, and love still in spite of them, but love cannot cease to will their removal. Love is more sensitive than hatred itself to every blemish in the beloved. Of all powers, he forgives most, but he condones least. He is pleased with little, but he demands all. That's the kind of love God pours out on us, and woven through every page of the Bible. I love you, says God. Like an artist creating his finest work, like a man training the animal he loves, like a father's love for his children, or a husband's love for his wife. God loves us, and that love involves discipline, so we can become like Christ. Now, based on these truths, the author exhorts his readers on the ground and persecuted these truths. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. In other words, take it seriously so you benefit from the discipline, but not so seriously that you lose heart and quit. Instead of giving up and giving in, we must get up and toughen up, knowing that God will empower us to do the very things he asks us to do. Keep loving, keep serving, keep worshiping, and keep trusting that God is making us like Christ, even if we can't see it. Even if we need to pray the redemption prayer 5 times a day, which I often did when I was selling door to door. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. Now, some hardships we cannot run away from. There may be no cure. Our loved one is gone and we're left alone. We cannot change the reality, but we still have choices. We can endure hardship as discipline and submit to God's perfecting purposes to make us like Christ. And if we can't understand, we can pray, Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. Some hardships we can run away from, and that, ironically, makes them even harder. You see, it's one thing to accept an unchangeable circumstance and trust God to make us like Christ through them. Quite another to stay in a hard circumstance for the sake of Christ, even though we could quit. 44 years ago, I began my vocational ministry as a pastor. I had no idea how much my summer as a door-to-door salesman prepared me for the kind of hardships I would experience, and most pastors, if not all, experience. The people who slammed doors in my face in the summer of 1971, I never saw again. The church members who, figuratively speaking, slammed the door in my face sat in the pew every week. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. But after 7 years, I forgot that prayer, and I wanted out. But the only way out was to resign to my boss, namely God. And here's how that went down. God spoke through the inner voice of the Holy Spirit. Let me get this straight, Pastor Chuck. You want to run away from the very thing I'm using to make you like Christ? But here's the thing. The hard-to-love people that you think are keeping you from your mission, they are your mission. And looking back, as hard as this is for me to admit, I was hard to love. I was their mission. And to be honest, as I look back, their mission to love me was harder than my mission to love them. Only I didn't see it that way at the time. And so too with all of us. Not everyone will be persecuted and thrown to the lions. Not everyone will be called to submit to North Korean type hardships, but all of us, even in some village, especially in some village, get the hardship of hard to love people. If we run from them, if we cut them off, if we say, they're toxic, I don't need them, then we will be running away from God's ordained method to make us like Christ. We'll be running away from the goal to be like Jesus. And when you run to the wrong goal, don't be surprised if God himself tackles you. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and become like Christ. 500 times or so I prayed that redemptive prayer. And maybe 10 times or so I repeated it in this sermon. Did I overdo it? Not even close. We still forget and need to be reminded again and again. The author says, you have forgotten. Well, you got that right. Let's see if we can remember. Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Hebrews 12:4. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Consider him. Consider him. And even if I cannot figure out what God's reason is, I can know what the reason isn't. It's not because God doesn't care. No one who did what God did by sending his son to the cross and what the son did by going to the cross on our behalf can ever be accused of not caring. And this was brought home to me by a story that I will tell you in the first person. I was sitting in a waiting room, and across from me were two men, when suddenly one of them went into an epileptic seizure. The other man immediately takes off his jacket, rolls it up, puts it behind the head of his friend, and calms him down. And when the seizure was over, he lifted his friend and gently placed him back into his seat. And then the caregiver turned to me and said something I will never forget. Mister, please forgive us. Sometimes this happens 2 or 3 times a day. My buddy and I were in Vietnam together, and we were both wounded. I had bullets in both my legs, and he had one in his shoulder. The helicopter that was supposed to come for us never came to pick us up. My friend picked me up, mister, and he carried me for 3.5 days out of that jungle. The Viet Cong were sniping at us the whole way. He was in more agony than I was. I begged him to drop me and save himself, but he wouldn't let me go. He got me out of that jungle, mister. He saved my life, and I don't know how he did it, but I know why he did it. He did it because he's my friend. And in the words of Jesus, greater love has no friend than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. 4 years ago, I found out that he had this condition, so I sold my house in New York, took what money I had, and I came over here to take care of him. You see, mister, after what he did for me, there isn't anything I wouldn't do for him. Likewise, after what Jesus did for me, there isn't anything that would make me think he doesn't care. He doesn't love me. There isn't anything that would make me forget his care and love. Let's not run from it or take it too lightly and lose heart. Let's let it do its work to make us like Jesus. Let us strengthen our feeble arms and weaknesses, which is the grand conclusion of this text. Get up, run the race God has marked out for you. And if you get tripped up, if you take a fall, hey, you know what to pray. Father, there's a reason and a purpose for this. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and be like Jesus.